Hello and welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to be doing a little bit of a layout update. I've been working on a couple of things in the background over the last few months, and there's also one or two small things that I've picked up for the layout as well. Over the past month I took a bit of a break from the layout. I think it's really important when you're building a model railway to take a break from it every now and then. I've seen so many people get really enthusiastic and get started in the hobby that they pretty much work themselves to death for a couple of months and just burn themselves out. So for example, it's quite normal for me to not come up here for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then when I do, the layout feels fresh, it feels exciting, I can approach new projects, and I can also look at stuff that I've done previously with a fresh pair of eyes and perhaps improve things and make some changes in the future. And it's really nice, it keeps the layout interesting for me, keeps things fresh and exciting, and I don't spend my entire life stuck in an attic. So to get things started, over on this side of the layout, I've been working on the lighting and I've been working on the wiring specifically for the lighting. All of the lit buildings and street lights in this section of the layout were just powered temporarily from a 12-volt power supply, and I really needed to get something more permanent set up as I was getting more and more lighting features on this section of the layout, and I've also got plans to extend that lighting around the rest of the layout as well. I've also completed the fascia boards on the front of the layout. These are now awaiting a coat of black paint just to blend things in. I think I mentioned that in the previous video, but it is really nice now having some nice bit of birch plywood just there to hide all of the Celotex insulation and baseboard framework. It just makes the layout look a little bit more professional. So looking underneath the layout, basically what I've done is I've added these two wires here. We've got a positive and a negative for a 12-volt DC power supply. That runs around the whole of the baseboard, and then I can connect into it to power the various lighting accessories in the various buildings and street lights and things like that. I've kept it nice and basic, so you can see we've got a junction there. Basically the bus comes into the right-hand side and then goes through that and carries on the left-hand side. And that connection there just allows me to plug various things in. So you can see we've got a street light up there, and over here running off in that direction we've got a street light as well. And it's just nice and easy, comes down here and connects. You haven't got to worry about making it too fancy. So now I just switch on the power supply and all of the lights come on. Power is just coming from this little transformer. You usually find these with various electrical devices, and as those electrical devices break or get replaced, you end up with these power bricks lying around the house. Don't know what this one was originally used for, but you can see it's got 2 wires just there, so it's ideal for just connecting up to the bus wire. And I think the output for this one is somewhere around 1.5, 2 amps maximum, something like that. So it's more than capable of running a couple of LEDs. Over on this side of the layout, I've changed the layout lighting to LED, which is something I'm slowly doing as I work my way around the room as the various fluorescent tubes burn out. So we've got 2 more converted to LED, and I'm quite happy with the colour temperature, and I think the countryside section now actually looks a bit better on camera at least. It always looked all right to my eyes, but the camera seems to be doing a better job now when it's over on this side of the room. Something else I've been working on in the background as and when I've had some time is a footbridge for the station. The station always needed a footbridge, and I wanted to make one that was in keeping with the sort of 80s time period, and also make something a little bit more interesting than your sort of just traditional sort of Pico or Hornby footbridge. It's made from plasticard, and I cut out most of the pieces on the Cricut Maker machine that you've seen me use several times now for various building projects on the layout. It was quite challenging to build, quite tricky, threw up a few challenges, and it's taken me probably 2 months to reach this stage, just sort of working on it off and on in the evenings after work. Currently it's just loosely placed on top of the baseboard. It's not got any foundations or been permanently glued down yet. I've taken inspiration from various footbridges around the country, but the main one that I drew inspiration from was the footbridge that stands at Oxford Station. That footbridge was built in about 1989, and it had this blue and red colour scheme, no doubt to go with the Network South East theming of the period. Today it looks quite a bit more dirty and a bit more run down, but it is still there. When it was originally built, it did not have any lift shafts. It was just simply a footbridge. It now has lift shafts. They've been added later on. I took the decision to add lift shafts to my structure here purely to give it an extra bit of strength, as the amount of glazing in the structure does make it a little bit fragile. It's certainly not the strongest thing, so the lift shafts just add an extra little bit of support for the building. This is still very much a work in progress, but I'm quite happy with how it's looking, and I was really pleased with the red accents that I was able to add to it, which just give it sort of that Network South East feel. You can see it's also got all the relevant handrails inside, and they're just made using bits of brass rod from Albion Alloys and then sprayed the appropriate colour. Of course it's not finished, there's plenty more to add to it, a little bit of weathering, a little bit of distress, not too much because it would have been a very new structure at the time, so I don't want to go too crazy with regards to making it look run down, but you can see the early stages of that have been started. Something I'll be doing is tinting the glazing. I've got some Tamiya paint downstairs which I'm going to try on a few scrap pieces and do a few bits of experimentation, but I think it needs some tinting to the glass, and that'll just give it that sort of period feel. And also I've noticed on my travels that quite a few of the footbridges you find at stations that are in a similar style to this, they tend to have smoked or tinted glass, so I think that's a bit lacking on this one here. It looks a little bit too see-through, so I hope to address that and just generally work on it over the coming months and make little improvements and changes. As you can see, the building is lit as per the rest of the structures over on this side of the layout. I've used several LEDs to do that, and then of course dimmed them with the appropriate resistor and applied some of the Tamiya clear orange paint to the lenses of the LEDs, just to give a little bit more of that sort of orange sodium lighting feel that was very commonplace during the time period, and I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. I've deliberately made some of the LEDs more orange than others, just to give the effect of some variation, replacement bulbs and things like that. I think with the addition of some platform furniture and some extra lighting on the platforms themselves, this whole thing will really come to life, and the footbridge should blend a little bit more into its surroundings. Currently at the moment it looks a little bit awkward because it's just sat atop some bare platforms, but once we get extra bits and pieces and detail in this section, I think it will really look at home. Obviously, this is a model railway, so there's always going to be some compromise somewhere. So I have taken a couple of liberties and changes with the design of the structure just to make it fit in the space I have. Obviously, my platforms are quite narrow, but it's a limitation of the layout. I don't have any more room. So I've just done my best to try and make things sort of fit into place and sort of look somewhat convincing. In real life, there might be some regulation or bit of red tape that would stop this from actually being built. But as is so often the case with model railways, you've always got to compromise somewhere, and I'm quite happy with how we've managed to get that looking so far. And as I've said previously, there's still a lot left to do on it. It's looking rather pristine at the moment, and it's certainly not finished. So hopefully over the next few months you'll notice this structure getting a little bit more customised and a little bit more improved. But for the time being, I'm going to focus on doing some other bits and pieces and have a break from this thing. Something else I've been working on is the replacement of the back scenes. The back scenes on the layout are made by ID Backscenes, and the original set were getting quite old, probably about 5 years old, and they were certainly starting to show their age. I'd used the paper back scenes previously and glued them to plywood. The new back scenes are exactly the same into the town back scene from ID Backscenes, but instead I've gone for the self-adhesive ones, and I've affixed those to some foam board rather than plywood. I custom ordered the foam board pre-cut to size for each section of back scene. The back scenes are 1.5 meters long, so I made sure I got a load of 1.5 meter long sections of foam board and then adhered the back scenes to those. That's had the benefit of massively reducing the number of joints in the back scene on the layout. I've probably halved the number of joints on the layout. And I've also noticed that these plastic self-adhesive back scenes have a little bit more vibrance and life in the colour with regards to the sky and some of the definition and stuff. They seem a little bit less washed out than my old paper ones were, and I think it's really given the layout a bit of a lift, and it looks quite nice. As you can imagine, fitting the back scenes was quite challenging and took a bit of time to do. I haven't got as far as I would like. I've only reached the far end just there, so basically I've got up to the end of this wall, and then from there it goes back to the previous paper back scenes. And I've done a couple of other bits on the countryside sections. They were relatively easy to get to, but it's a work in progress, and hopefully by the next update video I will have replaced all of the back scenes on the layout. And over here on the countryside section of the layout, these two back scene boards have been replaced. They were relatively easy to get to, as I've not finished the scenery, as you can see at the back of the layout just there. So I've done those two. Once again, that's another pair of 1.5 meter long sections of foam board with the 1.5 meter long ID back scene sections put onto those, and I've used the self-adhesive version, so it's very much a case of peeling off the backing paper slowly and progressively as you roll the back scene out onto the sheet. I found the back scenes worked quite well with regards to applying them. It was a little bit challenging. It's not perhaps as straightforward as just working with the ordinary paper ones. If you get a crease or something like that in the back scene, it pretty much ruins it and you have to buy another one and start again. But fortunately I've had a bit of experience with putting stripes and decals and stuff on cars, so I've got some of the spreader tools and stuff necessary to make a nice job of fitting these. So far they look good. They've only been up for a few days, so time will tell. But they certainly look a lot better than my previous paperback scenes that had bits of glue stuck to them, and even on this side there was a big lump of brown overspray by those trees, and it's nice now that that's all disappeared, and it certainly motivated me now to think about the gardens on this side and completing some of these semi-detached houses. Obviously you can see behind the fourth house there is a joint. The back scenes are always going to have joints in them. Look at any model railway, at any exhibition or anybody's private home, there will be joints in back scenes. It's just a fact of life. It's something you can't avoid. But I have managed to significantly reduce their number on this layout, so I'm quite pleased with how that's come together. Here you can see the replacement back scene to the right that's on the curve, and you can see where it meets the back scene to the left, that it does not flow through correctly. It's not quite right. That's fine. The back scenes to the left are going to get replaced as well. That was a little bit of an experiment on my part with regards to how to make back scene boards and trying to come up with something a little bit more professional over my previous paper back scene finish, and in the end I've gone for the foam board sheets cut to size, and that's worked out really well. So what I'll do is I'll reapply the back scene on the left here so that it lines up correctly with the next section on the right. It's just the way it sort of went together. For the time being, it's not too offensive, and I'll leave it, but over time, when I get the other 4 or so boards changed over, we'll have a nice uninterrupted flow of back scene around the layout, hopefully with only about 6 joints. And once again, the back scene is made by ID Backscenes, and this particular one is called Into the Town. I think it works quite well with the sort of model that I'm trying to build in front of it, and it's also one of the few back scenes that's available in a suitable length for a layout of this size. Here we have one of the new arrivals to the layout. Been really looking forward to these over the past 18 months or so. An Austin Maestro is a perfect fit for Everard Junction. There would have been absolutely loads of these about during the time period my layout is set, roughly speaking about 1989. Most railway modelers tend to get extremely carried away and overexcited with regards to the latest and greatest from the major manufacturers like Accurascale, Cavalex, Bachmann, Hornby, etc. But for me, I was really looking forward to this thing. This particular example, I've applied a grey wash to the various shut lines around the vehicle, which is as per my typical sort of process, and then I've given it a coat of satin varnish just to take the edge off of the paint. The Oxford die-cast vehicles are incredibly glossy when you get them, and they don't tend to lend themselves to model railways in that respect, looking very toy-like and overly glossy. This now looks a little bit more ropey and a little bit more how you would expect to see it when it was being driven around in 1989. Oxford Diecast have done a lovely job of capturing the shape of the Maestro, and it certainly looks quite convincing. It does have the typical sort of balloon tyres that Oxford Diecast like to fit to their vehicles, so I'll be turning those down and reducing those in size when I get a spare moment. But overall, really happy with the model, and I look forward to more 80s vehicles from Oxford Diecast in the future. Of course, I didn't just buy one of these, I bought several, so I've got a couple downstairs in the queue to be repainted. My dad had a sort of silvery blue metallic one back in the day, and I think a brown one would look quite good on the layout, or maybe British Racing Green or something like that. I'll have a look at the colour palette from Austin Rover, see what colours were available, and repaint the other ones that I've bought into various colours. Another new arrival is this Renault 4 from Oxford Diecast. There wouldn't have been a massive number of these on the road during the time period my layout is set, but there certainly were a few, and I think 1 or 2 on the layout wouldn't go amiss. I was quite heavily involved in the restoration of one of these a number of years ago, so it was only fitting that I would pick one up for the layout. It's even the same colour. As usual, I've gone over this with a grey wash in the panel lines and given it a coat of satin varnish just to take the gloss down on the paint, and you can see it looks a little bit more at home now with some of the other slightly ropey vehicles that frequent Everard Junction. Moving on to rolling stock, a trio of locos have arrived on the layout so far this year. First up we have this Class 58 from Helian. I purchased this model second hand from a friend of mine and got a good deal on it. This will contrast nicely with my existing Class 58 carrying the earlier Rail Freight red stripe livery. The 58 is perhaps my favourite locomotive. Whilst it's not a particularly attractive bit of kit, it did combine 2 things: British engineering and reliability, which was something very rarely seen, and for that reason I think it's a very important locomotive. These things really did transform British Rail's freight operations on the various workings that they were in charge of. These models are made by Helian, and whilst they're not the most amazing models ever made, they're certainly showing their age a little bit now. It is still currently the best you can get with a model of the Class 58, and already having a previous example on the left hand side, I thought it was only fitting, as the price was right, to add 036 to the collection. In addition to the 58, I've also added this pair of 33s, and the example on the left hand side, I've already applied a weathering treatment to it, and you may have seen it make a brief appearance in some of my previous videos. Both of these locos will be replacing my previous pairing of Helian 33s, as I have two examples of the previous retool, which has a few accuracies and errors in it, and just generally isn't quite as well finished, not perhaps quite as a nice model as the more recent offering from Helian. Both of these particular liveries are out of production, but in light of the current pricing for the forthcoming models and the ones that are currently in stock from Helian, I got these for quite a good price, and I'm pleased to add those to the fleet. The Red Stripe 58 and Triple Grey Class 33 will receive a weathering treatment similar to the Dutch 33 in the centre in due course. In terms of rolling stock, that's all I've added to the layout so far this year. Two of the locos were second hand, with the Dutch example being a new model, never been used before, but once again managed to find it for a reasonably good price, especially when compared to the price these command now. I've always been very fussy with regards to locomotives that I add to the layout, as I operate quite a strict 2-year time period and do my best to try and add locomotives that are in running numbers and liveries for real locomotives that would have been seen in the area that I model back in 1989. Doing that helps keep the layout a little bit more authentic and helps me sort of tell the story of what I'm trying to model, and it also just helps me keep a lid on the budget and control the spend. There are various locomotives on the horizon, and I've got a few pre-orders in place for various things from Accurascale and Cavalex, which hopefully will be hitting the shelves later this year. Once again, I've been rather choosy with my selection, as I try to operate a somewhat authentic collection on this layout. I've also never been much of a collector, preferring to weather my stock and run it, and if it doesn't get run, then I tend to move it on, as for me it just doesn't make sense to have loads of models sitting around in shelves. Staying with the locomotive theme, let's take a look at some older Bachmann Class 37s. I recently rebodied two of my examples using some new body shells that I purchased from Bachmann Spares, again to make both of those locomotives a little bit more authentic for this layout. The work mostly involves weathering, but I also lowered the body shells onto the bogies slightly, and hopefully you can see the difference on the left there, with that 37 looking a lot more realistic in the way it sits versus 046 on the right, which is the standard Bachmann model. While I've got this Class 37 body off for weathering, I thought we might as well do a couple of other little bits and pieces to it as well. So one of the things that annoys me the most perhaps about the Bachmann Class 37, the older version, is how high the model sits on its bogies. And I haven't got round to fixing it on this one and one of the other ones in my collection. So I thought we might as well do that now. So looking at the bogie on this older Bachmann Class 37, you can see that the ride height is basically governed by that grey piece of plastic sitting on top of the gear tower. Now my initial thought was to just file some material off of here and here, these two side pieces, but the problem in doing that is that this central sort of tube that the screw goes through also rests in the chassis block, so I would need to move this relief further down onto the plastic, and it'd just be a little bit more challenging to file. So I think what I'm going to do instead is remove material from the bottom here, as there is quite a bit of clearance between the drive shaft and the grey plastic itself, although it's difficult to see in this shot. Hopefully there you can get a better idea that there is probably about 1.5 millimeters of room between the mechanism and the top of that piece of plastic, so I shouldn't have any trouble in filing that down and then reattaching it. So I filed about 1 millimeter off of that piece of plastic, and I've just refitted everything back together. I'll put the body back on and see how things look. It's definitely lowered the chassis, or how much I'm not quite sure. I would have thought it'd be somewhere around 1 millimeter or so. I'll give it a quick test and just see how we're looking, look at a few pictures and see if we've got close to what it should be like. So I took both models apart and just filed away at that little piece of plastic on the top of the gear tower, and just kept reassembling them and tweaking things until I've got things looking about right. and it's probably difficult to tell on camera, but the model certainly looks a lot better, with the whole body of the locomotive being probably at least 1 millimetre, perhaps more, closer to the top of the bogie frames just there, and it looks much more convincing, and I'm quite happy with how they've turned out. So with that completed, I'll move on to the weathering for these two, which was the main focus for bringing them downstairs, as I replaced both of these body shells with these two back in the summer, and as you can see, they're still very much pristine. Another small job I've done to both of these is to fit some buffer beam detail. On the older Bachmann Class 37, buffer beam detail is it's not great, leaves a little bit to be desired. So using some spare locomotive accessories that I've had lying around in my box of spares for a few years now, I've just cut a few pieces about and drilled a couple of small holes in the buffer beam and stuff to try and sort of get the front end here looking a little bit more convincing for 142 and 104, again using real pictures for reference. I'll basically be doing my usual style, so we'll run the panel line wash all over the sort of areas of detail on the model, so the grills, shut lines, edges of doors, things like that basically. And then once that has dried, we'll go over it with a cotton bud and some thinner and tone that back, and that should get some nice ingrained dirt in all of the details. Particularly on a split box 37 such as this one, there's a lot of detail at the front, such as the old nose end doors and stuff like that, so these really benefit from a panel wash to highlight all of that detail. Now, as always, when you do this process, after this particular stage, it always looks absolutely terrible, but when you get the cotton buds out and rub away the excess, that's where the magic happens. Probably end up removing 60 to 70% of this, and you get a lovely weathered finish once that's complete. I've gone over the entire locomotive with the weathering wash, and as you can see, I've just put it in all of the vents and grills and detail and stuff, and I've also focused on any areas where the rain might wash dirt down the side of the body shell. So a good example here is the bottom of the cab window. If you look at pictures of these things, there's always a bit of staining going down from there. So I've just sort of applied that logic to the whole loco and just covered it in the Tamiya weathering wash. So the next stage, as you've seen me do in several videos before, is to take some airbrush thinners. I just use the stuff from VMS, seems pretty good, and some cotton buds, and we're going to wipe in the direction that the rain would fall down the side of the loco, and we're just going to keep doing that until we remove enough of this excess panel line wash until we get the sort of effect that we're after. And in doing that, we're also going to end up streaking some of that weathering wash down the side of the loco, and that's going to look quite convincing, and we can vary the intensity in different places by using the cotton buds.
Looking at pictures of the real loco, there's quite a lot of build-up of dirt very much along the top cant rail and the bottom of the body shell. So just applying a little bit more weathering wash in these areas, letting it dry, and then I'll be able to build that area up a little bit more with the cotton buds.
So it's still very much a work in progress at the moment, but you can see that rubbing off most of that panel line wash has left behind a nice sort of realistic appearance, and it gives that locomotive a sort of used look, makes it look a little bit closer to the pictures of the real thing. If you compare it to this pristine example on the left hand side, you can see how it looks a little bit toy-like, with everything being perfect yellow. In reality that wouldn't happen, and despite however many times you attempted to wash this front end on this 37, you would never get all the dirt out of the marker light boxes, the tail lamps, the door handles, the lamp irons, the old door hinges, and the boxes for filling up the sand. So I've continued to work with the panel line wash. You can see we've got a nice build-up of grime along the very bottom of the body of the loco, which is very close to the pictures of the real thing that I found online. I've also added some more dirt to the grills at the nose ends of the loco, again following pictures. So I'm quite happy with the general finish there. So now it's time to get the airbrush out, do a little bit of exhaust dirt and a little bit of general sort of dirt spray and stuff here and there. Nothing too much. I always try and shy away from plastering the models in filth with the airbrush, but we will do a little bit here and there and add a little bit of variation to the bogies. On the real loco, there's quite a lot of black oil and grease from the step on the bogie towards the fuel tanks, with the sort of leading edge of the bogie being a more sort of brown colour. So we'll make sure that we sort of touch that up. This chassis, as I've said, is a chassis I've had for several years, so it's already got some weathering on it. It's just the body shell that I've changed. So that completes the weathering on the two Class 37s, and they're now both back up and running on the layout. I've stuck to a relatively light weathering for 37142, again following pictures of it in real life. You'll notice that the double arrow on the cab side is massive, and it is supposed to be. For some reason, that's the size of logo this locomotive carried in real life. As you can see, there's dirt and grime in all of the various grills, exhaust dirt on the roof and some around the radiator fan, and a little bit of streaking down the body side, but nothing too severe. And I've touched up a few little bits on the bogies and the fuel tanks, but nothing too major. Obviously there's a little bit of a wash around the nose ends, and other than that I've pretty much left it as is. It's quite clean, but you can see it's got a used appearance and it blends in nicely to the rest of my rolling stock. 104 didn't visit the Western region as often, judging by the research I've done, but there's plenty of pictures of it working around the London area, so I'm sure it happened once or twice every now and then. Either way, it's a smart livery, and I do like the split box 37, so again, that's why I chose this particular body on the existing chassis that I already had. You can see this 37 is quite a bit dirtier than the other one, and I'm quite pleased with the appearance of that. It still shows all of the nice bits and pieces of the livery, and once again I've followed quite closely to the pictures of the real loco in real life. Taking that little bit of plastic off of the gear towers and lowering the locomotive onto its bogies has made a massive difference to the overall appearance of the loco, and these now, next to the newer tooled Bachmann Class 37, would at a distance be difficult to tell apart. I've made the same modification to 142, and I'm really pleased, as I say, with the overall appearance of the loco. Perhaps for me the biggest shortcoming of the older Bachmann Class 37 was the distance between the body and the bogie. After the modification they both seem to run fine. I wouldn't know that the modification has been done in terms of their running qualities. It appears unchanged. No problems on fourth radius track or Pico streamline points. So in terms of layout progress for this month, that's pretty much it. As I say, I took a bit of a break from the layout. I'd done a bit of work on the back scenes, worked on that footbridge, and also improved some of the layout lighting in terms of the way it's all wired up. And things are certainly headed in the right direction. But as I said at the beginning of the video, it's not a race, and I like to enjoy it as and when the mood takes me. So let's move on to something a little bit different. With regards to taking a break from the layout, like I said previously, I recently took a 5-day trip to Scotland. I tend to go to Scotland about once every 2 years or so, and a lovely part of the world it is too. The last time I went by car, and whilst I'm a keen driver and I very much enjoy cars and driving, it was an exhausting journey, and it took me 8.5 hours to get there. So this time I thought, let's go on the train again, like I did the first time. And I'd also not travelled on a train since 2019, at least on National Rail. I used to travel by train for work quite frequently several years ago, but it's not something I really do anymore in my current job. So travel by train is always a bit of a novelty for me now, and I always really enjoy it. And of course, going up to Scotland was a great excuse to see the Intercity 125, Class 43, HST, whatever you want to call it, as there's not that many of these left in service now, and those that are typically found in Scotland. Starting my trip in King's Cross Station, it's apparent just how different the railway scene has become just in a couple of years. When I visited previously in 2019, there was a great variety of rolling stock and traction at the station, but today it's a rather more mundane affair. However, it's nice to see that some of the Class 91s are still about, still plying this route, and they've certainly given them a nice coat of paint. I wasn't too keen on this when I first saw it, because, it's the wrong colour, basically, for the Falcon Grey, but actually in the flesh, very smart, and I thought it was quite impressive. This was my first trip on an LNER Class 800, and I'd heard lots of different opinions and things over the years since their introduction with regards to whether or not they were any good. Generally, I thought it was a nice train. It was quick, it rode well, it was quiet, the climate control was especially good, the temperature in the coaches on all my journeys was very comfortable. The Class 91, I always found the Mark IV to be rather cold and can be a little bit uncomfortable if you're sitting at the end of the coach. Onboard service was very good, cleanliness was very good, the trains feel new and fresh. Catering, as typical with trains, leaves a little bit to be desired, but it was offered, it was there. I wouldn't exactly call my £6 meal deal a deal, but it was food and it did the job. Overall, I was impressed with the 800. I thought it provided a good level of service, but the seat is the big letdown. It takes a long distance train and turns it into an uncomfortable commuter train that's being used for long distances. Still, it's impressive to get from London to Edinburgh in under 4.5 hours, and it's quite nice zipping along the countryside at 124 miles an hour, especially when you're going past congested roads that I was stuck on in my most recent trip in 2021. I also visited York at the weekend for the York Model Railway Show, a show I've not been to before. An enjoyable event with quite a lot to see, and it's really nice being so close to the National Railway Museum, as it provides a nice day out. You can do the show in the morning, and you can do the Railway Museum in the afternoon. Apart from LNER, most of my other travelling was done aboard ScotRail trains. Whilst I'm not a local and I don't travel by ScotRail particularly often, the intensive bit of travelling I did during my few days certainly showed that ScotRail seemed to be struggling a little bit perhaps. Lots of the services are quite heavily congested, and reliability seems to be a bit of an issue with some of the rolling stock. As an outsider, I felt that they're very reliant on the Class 170 and the Class 158, these units providing for the most part reliable service, but they certainly seem too small for the services they're being asked to operate. There's many cases where people were standing aboard the trains, and when things get really tough, all that seems to happen is a 170 gets coupled to a 158 to make a somewhat suitable 5-car train. However, I've no axe to grind with the company or the trains themselves. I actually quite like the 170 because it has really nice big windows and it gives you excellent views of things like the Tay Bridge, for example. And of course, I've always liked the 158 being a British Rail design and arguably the unit that saved provincial or regional railways during the 1980s, giving a massive boost in the level of service provided over long distance rural travel. The 158 really is quite an impressive and important DMU. Of course, one of the main draws for the visit was to ride aboard an HST, as I'm not really sure how many more years we're going to be able to do this, so I thought I'd take the opportunity, and it's always nice to ride aboard a classic BR design in some spectacular countryside. Unfortunately, reliability of the HST was not great on my trip, and despite only being in the area for 4 or 5 days, I was made aware of at least 2 complete failures of HSTs whilst in service, one of which I was actually booked on out of Inverness. When you get up close to these classic trains in the station, it is apparent just how tired and worn out these things are. It's amazing that they're still in service. It's incredible the effort and the time that's going into them to keep them on the rails, but as someone who has worked in restoration most of my life, it is very clear that these things need an awful lot of work if they're going to stay in service for much longer. To be honest, that's what I was expecting, and it was just really nice to see them in the flesh and ride aboard a Mark III, perhaps for one last time. Overall, the weather couldn't have possibly been any better, and I visited Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, Inverness and Perth. So it was a nice little trip around Scotland, or at least part of Scotland, and I hope in the future to visit the western side and explore a little bit more of the country. So that will bring this video to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. A little bit of everything in this one, but as you can see, I have made some progress on the layout itself. There's a few more new arrivals, and I had a nice little railway themed trip away as well, which is always nice. As always, I'll be back as soon as I can once I've made some more progress on the layout and I've got some stuff to show you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.